Greetings and welcome. Today we're finishing up our discussion of Browning's book, Ordinary Men, and also some excerpts, which I've kind of expanded on in this set of slides, excerpts from the fascinating and horrifying book by Jan Gross called Neighbors. So what are we dealing with in these 2 weeks, these last 2 weeks? Browning and Gross are both treating the subject of ordinary perpetrators. They're both addressing the fact that in the Holocaust, in the genocide, in the Shoah, in the final solution, there were massive events of extermination, mass killing of Jewish people and sometimes non-Jewish people, sometimes ordinary Poles for that matter, who, and those episodes of mass killing were conducted by what Browning refers to as ordinary men. Now, one thing which is kind of interesting in considering the material which Browning is presenting to us, and then the content of the book Neighbors, is that in a sense, these seem like rather different kinds of mass murder. In the case of Jan Gross's book, the horrifying violence in murder, which took place in Jabwabne, took place by local people, vigilantes and neighbors and residents of the town. The town was only about 3,000 people, and half of them were Jews and half of them were killed in this 1 or 2 days of rampant and organized and deliberate killing of the Jews. So we've got what you might call a pogrom occurring in Jabwabne, and the routinized murder and execution of Jews that fell within the final solution, the design of the final solution, and was carried out in this instance by the Order Police Battalion 101, a group of some well, not a handful, but roughly 500 individuals. Browning's key point, as we saw last time, is that the members of Order Police Battalion 101 were ordinary men. They were not ideologically extreme on the whole. They were not psychopathological. They were not dedicated Nazis. Some were, but the majority were not dedicated Nazis. Gross, in his book, Neighbors, considers the less organized but equally appalling violence that was undertaken by ordinary Polish peasants and villagers against the Jews of Jabwabne. Gross ascribes a fairly ordinary motivation to the Polish murders, and this is a desire to rob the Jews of their property. What could be a more basic and more mundane motive for violence than the desire to take the other person's property? Browning needs a more complex and more involved theory of motivation, and he is interested in finding a theory of behavior that makes sense of the systematic murders which occurred by the men of the police battalion in both Ukraine and in Poland. Now, there is an interesting question, and it arises both in the Polish case and also in the case of the police battalion. And that is the question, what happens after these events? Can these, quote, ordinary men return to ordinary life? And both Browning and Gross give some indication of what occurred with these men in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And the surprising fact, or perhaps it isn't surprising to you, is that the mass murderers of Police Battalion 101 returned to fairly normal, humdrum lives following the end of the war and the Nazi regime. It's almost from the outside as if their monstrous behavior was erased in some odd way. Some of these men, and this is extracted from the interviews which occurred in the 1960s, some of these men returned to careers or continued careers in the police force in Hamburg. Others returned to civilian occupations, which had been their work before the war. A few were tried for murder and for other kinds of crimes, including Buchmann, whom we've talked about several times. Buchmann was in fact tried for murder and was sentenced to 8 years in prison, which eventually was reduced to 4 years in prison. Browning Browning is a fairly analytical writer. He's interested in figuring out how various events occurred and how we should classify them, how we should think about them. But he distinguishes between two different kinds of atrocity in warfare. He distinguishes between what he calls battlefield frenzy, and he puts the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War into that category of soldiers who are under stress, who are frustrated, and who act contrary to orders and then commit terrible crimes. In the case of Lieutenant Calley at My Lai, killing innocent villagers, including women and children. So that's one kind of atrocity. The other is what Browning refers to as standard operating procedure atrocities, atrocities which have been planned by the higher administration, the higher authorities in the military or the police, and which have then been carried out by their subordinates through a chain of command, and which are then implemented in villages and towns with terrible effect. Quoting from Browning, both kinds of atrocities occur in the brutalizing context of war, but the men who carry out atrocity by policy are in a different state of mind. They act not out of frenzy, bitterness, and frustration, but with calculation. Clearly, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, in implementing the systematic Nazi policy of exterminating European Jewry, belong in the second category. He takes some notice of the idea that in some way, in the case of the police battalion, maybe there's some workings of the idea of bureaucratic behavior, behavior within an organization. And this quote I found especially useful. Many scholars of the Holocaust, especially Raoul Hilberg, have emphasized the bureaucratic and administrative aspects of the destructive process. This approach emphasizes the degree to which modern bureaucratic life fosters a functional and physical distancing in the same way that war and negative racial stereotyping promote a psychological distancing between perpetrator and victim. This is sort of the Eichmann presentation of his behavior, that he was operating within a bureaucracy, and his connection to the killing that occurred in extermination camps was very distant. He was merely a bureaucrat. But Browning is not satisfied with that theory of behavior within the final solution, within the Nazi extermination plans. And so he considers other theories, some of which we're now familiar with. He considers the idea that there are situational, contextual drivers of behavior, situational drivers having to do with social roles and expectations, and the statements and behavior of leaders. And here he refers to the Stanford prison experiment. He refers also to something we haven't discussed, but something I find very interesting, and that is Theodor Adorno's theory of authoritarian personality. Adorno was a member of the Frankfurt School of Marxism before World War II. During the 1930s, he also was Jewish. He escaped to the United States and spent a lot of his career in California, and was a theoretician, but he also engaged in some psychological research and came forward with the idea that we can measure personality in terms of the degree to which the individual is vulnerable to authoritarianism. And this is a very interesting theory, but I won't go into it further. There's also the possibility that selection is what accounts for the behavior of units like Lieutenant Calley's unit or the Order Police unit, that individuals who can be recognized as being potential murderers are actually selected for the unit. And in the end, he feels that there's no basis for that in understanding Police Battalion 101, that this is a pretty random assignment. A fourth idea is the notion that there is a powerful individual motivational source which comes from existing within an authority structure and being subject to commands from above. And here he refers to the Milgram experiments. These are the electric shock experiments, which I think we've referred to. And then finally, he refers to indoctrination. Take ordinary people, put them into a structured context with situational drivers and so forth, and then give them a very deliberate pattern of indoctrination and enculturation to anti-Semitism, to the inferior status, the non-human status of the individuals who are to be subject to attack. Could indoctrination be the explanation? Could deliberate effort to create racist and anti-Semitic attitudes and emotions in the members of the battalion, could that be the explanation for their willingness to comply? And here again, he isn't convinced that that is a good explanation of the behavior of Battalion 101. He makes a very strong statement. It's a good statement. It's an interesting statement. It kind of carries on from an observation that we pursued last week, but I'll just read this quote about responsibility and choice. Quoting Browning, "This story of ordinary men is not the story of all men. The reserve policemen faced choices, and most of them committed terrible deeds. But those who killed cannot be absolved by the notion that anyone in the same situation would have done as they did. For even among them, some refused to kill and others stopped killing. Human responsibility is ultimately an individual matter." And we saw some of those cases last week, but we also saw the case of Bonhoeffer, who throughout his short life as a leading theologian and minister in Germany, refused to accept the murderous ideology of Nazism. Let's turn now kind of briefly to Jan Gross. I didn't ask you to read very much of the article of the book. It is a powerful book. It's an important book, and I encourage you to read it further if you are interested. But I've tried to pick out some especially relevant passages and chapters for our consideration. This map kind of makes it very concrete how small the village of Jedwabne is, or Jedwabne. It's just a few dozen houses, basically, surrounded by forests and fields, and it's a very compact area in which the people of Jedwabne lived. The massacre occurred on July 10th, 1941, about 2 weeks after the German army had occupied the region, including this town. And it was a horrific, just an almost impossibly horrible massacre by Polish people, not by German soldiers, not by special police, not by Ukrainians brought in for the task, but by Polish people, by neighbors, sometimes referred to in the documents as hooligans, a murder, a massacre of the 1,500 Jews of the town. And the accounts, the first-person descriptive accounts, are horrifying for the details of torture, degradation, rape, extermination, culminating finally in burning several hundred people to death in a barn by locking them and chasing them, pushing them, forcing them into the barn, soaking the barn with kerosene, barring the doors and burning it to the ground and killing them all. Here's a quote that is worth reading. "In Jedwabne, ordinary Poles slaughtered the Jews, very much as ordinary Germans from the Order Police Battalion number 101 did in Józefów, as documented in Browning's Ordinary Men." So ordinary Poles in Poland, ordinary men in the cases described by Browning. They were men of all ages and of different professions, entire families on occasion, fathers and sons acting in concert, Good citizens, one is tempted to say, if sarcasm were not out of place given the hideousness of their deeds, who heeded the call of municipal authorities. And what the Jews saw, to their horror, and I dare say incomprehension, were familiar faces, not anonymous men in uniforms, cogs in a war machine, agents carrying out orders, but their own neighbors who chose to kill and were engaged in a bloody pogrom, willing executioners. That is a very powerful paragraph and one that's worth reading and reflecting on and kind of keeping in your mind. A little bit of description of what occurred there. The slaughter of Jablonne's Jews lasted an entire day, and it was confined to a space no bigger than a sports stadium. Slozinski's barn, where the majority of the pogrom victims were burned in the afternoon, was but a stone's throw from the square in the center of town. The Jewish cemetery, where many of the victims were knifed, clubbed, and stoned to death, is just across the road. And so everybody who was in town on this day and in possession of a sense of sight, smell, or hearing either participated in or witnessed the tormented deaths of the Jews of Jablonne. Another quote, one big subject is omitted, and this is the question of motivation. Why did these ordinary citizens and possibly hooligans from the countryside, why did they act with such violence? Why did they come to murder the Jews? And here is part of his explanation. One big subject is omitted from the sources and testimonies at our disposal. What happened to the property of the Jablonne Jews? Those Jews who survived the war knew that they had lost everything. As to who took over the property or how it was disposed of, this is not a subject they address in their memorial book. During interrogations in the 1949 and 1953 trials, neither the witnesses nor the accused were asked questions about this either. A little further on, the same people who had organized the pogrom afterward took charge of Jewish property as well. And so, grotesque as it is, Jan Gross believes that even more fundamental than background Polish anti-Semitism, even more fundamental are the impulses of envy, desire for property, and theft and plunder. Again, quoting, given our growing awareness of the importance of material expropriation as a motivating factor in the persecution of the Jews all over Europe, I would think it very probable that the desire and unexpected opportunity to rob the Jews once and for all, rather than or alongside with atavistic anti-Semitism, was the real motivating force that drove Kerouac and his cohort to organize the killing. So Jan Gross forces us, if we have the courage to read the book and to read it with our eyes open, Gross forces us to stare at inconceivable cruelty, suffering, and evil. The deaths, the murderous deaths, the violent and tortured deaths of 1,500 Jews, of men, women, and children who were killed in the most vicious, cruel, and sadistic ways imaginable, including the burning in the barn. The fact that they were killed by fellow villagers and hooligans from the surrounding area in an organized, purposeful pogrom. Gross also acknowledges and emphasizes that anti-Semitism is evident, but he believes the motive of plunder is even more important. And then in consideration of his book, like Browning's book, we are forced to ask, how could ordinary people inflict these horrors on their neighbors?